of the University of the Highlands and Islands. Just switch off that one. Today we are very, very pleased to have our visiting lecturer, Dr. Veerle van den Eynden, who is coming here to talk about her recent research into plants and in Scotland. And Veerle has done a lot of work on ethnobotany in the past, and she's going to be presenting that work to us. And she's currently a visiting lecturer with us and teaching on our BA program, Culture and Heritage. So we're very much looking forward to hearing your presentation, Veerle. And for everybody, I'll just let you know that this is being recorded, so you can catch up later, and you can tell others afterwards as well if they would like to listen to the lecture. So, People and Plants in Scotland, a Contemporary View. Please, Veerle, go ahead. I think you're muted, Veerle.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I couldn't find the toggle for it. And presumably you can all see my screen now as well.
We can see it. Yep.
Yeah.
It's
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much. So yes, I've been a visiting lecturer for the topic of people and plants with UHI through Orkney College for about 15 years, I think now. So this stems from where I started my career in investigating how people relate to the natural environment, use natural resources, use plants, etc. And I've studied this indeed in various countries, including in Scotland. So the module I lecture for UHI is called People in the Natural Environment. And so the presentation I give here in the lecture gives sort of a snap view of the different topics we consider in this lecture and the type of interesting information one can find out about how people relate to plants nowadays. So we're going to look at how people use, view, perceive plants and nature. I'll talk about a bit of history, but I'll also focus strongly on what plants mean to us in our lives nowadays, with a look at aspects such as medicine, foods, cultural aspects and symbolism, and environmental aspects. When we look at plant uses from a sort of a more traditional point of view, then we're all aware that people would use plants that are available in their specific environment. Yeah, when you look nowadays at traditional societies, and when you look at plant uses there or how people relate to the environment, then you can see that people need to find provisions for all their needs in that natural environment. And so that is in plants, animals, minerals that are available, water, etc. Yeah. Of course, our society is very different. We no longer have those needs. We have the whole world to find our resources here. And that also means that plant uses, so plants, to traditional societies, plants are available within that environment. And the uses that people then make of plants are influenced by obviously certain characteristics of the plants. That can be physical characteristics, that can be chemical characteristics of plants. Think about medicinal properties, think about food, etc. And in the case of those physical characteristics, items such as woody materials, fibers, etc. So some of the examples you see here is a traditional heather creel. A lot of that material has been collected by an initiative called Woven Communities, made of heather. And it's obviously heather lent itself to being used as a fibrous plant to make baskets and was readily available. When you look at other countries or other environments, then other materials will be used for those types of crafts. But plant uses are also influenced by beliefs and how plants are perceived. And we'll look at examples of that in the contemporary context later on as well. But here, for example, an example that looks back at the past, eyebright. There was a time when there was the belief that one could see in a plant what it could be used for. It's called the doctrine of signatures around the 16th, 17th centuries. So this was a belief that was strongly influenced by religion, the idea that God showed us what we should use plants for. And so eyebright, as you can see from the picture, looks a lot like eye. So the belief was that it could be used to treat eye infections. And lo and behold, it is still used. As you can see from the herbal remedy there, eyebright, euphrasia drops, it is still used nowadays as a herbal treatment for eye infections. When we look at how one can study past plant uses, then obviously we have information that is available in literature. We have information that's available through folklore, and there's also evidence that we can find in archaeology. That's one of the examples I'm going to focus on here, a bit on the relationship between archaeology and how that teaches us or tells us how plants might have been used in the past. Through archaeological finds, we can find out about, we can try and resurrect uses of plants for food, for drinks, for materials, for medicine, etc. Yeah. And an example quoted here, unusual food plants from Oakland, Cranach, including cloudberry, opium poppy, and speltweed. Now, cloudberry is shown there on the picture. It's a type of bramble, but it has bright yellow, orange fruits rather than the purple ones that we're used to. It's very common in Scandinavian countries. You can find it still in Scotland in the higher mountain ranges, but the likelihood of you being able to pick enough fruits to make even a pot of jam is very small. But anyway, so in archaeological finds in Oakland, Cranach, cloudberry pips had been found alongside other items, and then archaeologists try and interpret that to say, what does that tell us if we find that in a cranach, which is based at low altitude, and we know that the cloudberry grows at high altitude. So the likelihood is that it has been collected and has been brought there, and therefore would have been used for food. Yeah. So archaeo-botany or archaeo-ethnobotany is then very interesting. Obviously, normally plants would rot away and wouldn't survive for hundreds, let alone thousands of years. There's certain circumstances when they wouldn't rot away, and that's where we can try and find out about historical or prehistorical plant uses. Pollen of flowers, for example, is highly resistant to degradation and stays around for a very long time. It has very interesting characteristics in that whilst it is microscopic, you can't see it with the naked eye, but when you look at it under microscopes, it has very species-specific shapes and features. So you can identify which plant it would have come from through those characteristics. But of course, also because you can't see it, and it flies around everywhere, there's of course also easy contamination that might occur in archaeological circumstances, in digs, etc. Yeah, but it can tell us something about, for example, historical vegetation cover. In certain times, did we have woodland here? Did we have grassland areas? Was there certain crops that were being cultivated, etc.? And it could also tell us something about how flowers might have been used, for example, for honey, in honey and honey preparations. So you do find evidence where those interpretations are found based on pollen evidence. Other plant remains you might find in an archaeological context is where plants are carbonized, and then they also are less due to rotting away, and they might be kept. And you can see a picture there at the top of carbonized hazel shells. And that's an interesting find. You can see a snapshot of the paper. The presentation will be shared, so you can go and explore those links if you're interested in that, where a large amount of carbonized hazelnut shells were found on Colonsay. And then the interpretation of how can, what does that tell us? The fact that you have a large amount of those burned shells being found, does that tell us that there might have been trade, there might have been some form of processing taking place, because the quantities might be too much for just domestic use, etc. So carbonized plant remains. Also on waterlogged sites, you might find plant remains that haven't rotted away. Think about bogs, peats, or the cranach, the example that we just saw from the cloudberry pips. Frozen remains, we all know the case of Utsi, and that has provided a lot of interesting information of plant uses and other uses that occurred in his time. Drying, so desiccated remains, and then also food use could be derived from human remains, teeth marks, and skeletal compositions, for example. But of course, those archaeological finds pose particular challenges, because usually it's very small amounts of material that is being found. So I think the case of the cloudberry seeds is like 2 or 3 seeds have been found. And what does that tell us? No. Often the remains might have been burned, might have been digested, partly destroyed, etc. So archaeologists then try to find out what species this might have been. Yeah. Some uncertainty also comes from the fact that you can't assume that past uses would have been exactly the same as the present uses we would give to those plants nowadays. So you can do some comparison maybe with traditional societies, but of course that's a certain level of uncertainty you bring in there as well. And of course, there's a lot of uses that wouldn't leave any remains, yeah? Where plants might be used for medicinal decoctions or something like that. Something you drink, something you eat might not leave any remains at all. But evidence has been found in Scotland through those archaeological finds for uses of plants for food, for materials, for clothes, for fuel. That's as far as history is. There's of course a lot of other historical things to be said about plant uses, but I want to move on to contemporary uses of plants, as that is something I particularly like focusing on in the lectures as well. When we look at contemporary plant uses, and I'm going to sketch different examples on different topics, we'll see that there's some level of keeping or reviving traditional uses, so an evolution or a reviving of those traditional uses that we can find in literature, for example, where people are interested in that. But we also see a lot of novel uses, economic, cultural uses, and there's also a level of the appeal to things natural that brings people back to maybe reviving certain plant uses or reintroducing new plant uses. A first aspect, medicines. When we look at plants and medicines, and there's different aspects that we can look at. Obviously, plants might be used as herbal remedies, for example, directly for treatments, and we'll come to that. But I'm first going to focus on drugs, which ultimately is what is mostly used in medicine nowadays, in medicinal treatments. Yeah, but of course the reality is that a lot of drugs are actually derived from plants, have been derived from plants in the past, but even nowadays new drugs are still developed from plants. Sometimes that means that they're directly produced from plant extracts that are made. But a lot of the times, especially nowadays, it is synthetic production derived from particular plant compounds. Drug companies prefer to work with single compounds plant extracts tend to be very diverse and have lots of compounds. So drug companies work with very structured synthetic single compounds. And of course, they want to make sure that every single item they produce is exactly the same. So there's no variation. The reason drugs can develop from plants is that plants themselves produce very powerful chemicals that then happen to provide medicinal properties. And the reason for that, it's not, of course, that plants are altruistic and like to produce medicinal medicines for us, for our benefits, but it is that plants produce those compounds to defend themselves against grazing, against insect attacks, against bacterial attacks, etc. And it's those chemicals that protect the plants, that help them to survive, that often are the ones that have got these medicinal properties. When we look at drug development from plants, then it can be that traditional medicines develop into drugs. So plants that are traditionally used in medicinal healing and that are known to have certain properties may have developed into drugs. And some examples, for example, is foxglove that was used traditionally to treat dropsy and swellings. Has been from foxglove, we now have heart stimulants that have been developed for that are commonly used as drugs. Quinine is another example, was for a long time used to treat malaria, extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree, and was traditionally used, or is still traditionally used in South America to treat fevers. But equally, drug companies are always on the lookout for new compounds that they can investigate for their properties, and often they do bioprospecting, mass screening of plants in certain areas, or mass screening of plants that are used by traditional societies, etc., to just see whether there's any interesting characteristics that might be found in there. And an example that has been developed in that way is, for example, Taxol, which is nowadays used in chemotherapy for the treatment of various types of tumor cancers. It was found in the bark of the Pacific yew tree in America, and it could be extracted directly from that bark into the compound that is needed to have that particular characteristics, Taxol or paclitaxel. But of course, that was not a sustainable way to produce this particular chemotherapy drug, because of course harvesting the bark from trees would just kill them, and so there wouldn't be enough trees ever to produce enough. But then it was, after lots of research, it was found that it could also be synthesized from another compound that could be extracted from the needles of the common yew tree that grows, for example, in the UK as well. So actually for many years, those needles were being collected and could be handed in different places, particularly to facilitate this production of this way to produce Taxol. That's drugs. Then we have complementary and alternative medicines. And those that are plant-based are, for example, herbal remedies. In the case of herbal remedies, you use a direct plant extract. We all probably are familiar with echinacea drops, or with arnica cream. That is an arnica extract that is used to treat bruises in an external use in that case. And on the picture you also see various herbal teas that are being used for medicinal purposes. Yeah. St. John's wort, for example, for depression, etc. Homeopathy is the next one. In that case, homeopathy is based on very diluted extracts and the principle of treating like with like. So treating symptoms with something that would cause the same symptoms, but then in a very diluted form. quite controversial because there's a lot of debate on whether or not that is based on any scientific evidence. Well, it isn't based on much scientific evidence, but it is still widely used. So it causes a lot of controversy. Aromatherapy uses essential oils in massages or through inhalation for treatment purposes. And Bach flower remedies is another example that's even more elusive. That's based on flower energy and the treating of emotions, where flowers are floated in water and that absorbs the energy into the water, and that is what becomes the Bach flower remedy. What is common with these, they're commonly used as we know, throughout the world, but definitely also in Scotland, these complementary and alternative medicines. There's very little connection with local folk knowledge that might have existed in the past. It's really based on a lot of exchanges and on a universal knowledge. So that we might equally be using herbal remedies that are derived from knowledge in the US or from Chinese medicine, etc. So obviously, the world being as it is, this information gets exchanged a lot. So there's not much of a connection with traditional knowledge in that. But up to 70,000 plants are used worldwide for healing. And of course, in a lot of societies, this is a very important part of the medicinal setup, the treatments that are available to societies. And it's also supported by the World Health Organization to play its role in the provision of healthcare. It is still seen a lot by a lot of people as a more natural solution than drugs. Obviously they are, except for herbal remedies, which is a direct extract from a plant and can be as potent and as powerful as a drug. The other ones obviously do not have these powerful chemicals in them, so can indeed rightly so be seen as more natural solutions with less risk of harm or side effects. And I'm going to show some examples because there's quite a lot of research that has actually been done in Scotland on these complementary and alternative medicines. So here, for example, a survey being done amongst health professionals of NHS Highlands in 2014, where these health professionals were being asked whether they themselves had been using CAM, not whether they were prescribing it, but whether they for themselves had been using complementary and alternative medicines. And of those that responded, 85% indicated that they had been using it, and the highest expected benefit from CAM was quoted to be in mental health, depression, and palliative care treatments. Another study carried out, this was based on a search through the General Practice Administration System for Scotland, carried out over a one-year period, 2003-2004, that looked at homeopathic and herbal prescribing in general practice in Scotland. And so the database contains information for nearly 2 million patients across 333 general practices in Scotland, finding that 60% of Scottish general practices were prescribing homeopathic or herbal remedies, and that was to about 4,500 patients in total. And you can see in the tables there the type of things that would be prescribed. So amongst homeopathic remedies, arnica, the same that is used for external treatment as a salve, can also be used as a homeopathic remedy equally for injury and bruising. The second one is poison ivy. The third one is copper, and then pulsatilla. And amongst the herbal remedies, the top one is gentian, cranberry, and a mixture, evening primrose, etc. The next study, this was a questionnaire that was done with patients at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, general surgery. So patients that were coming in for surgical treatment and asked to complete a questionnaire asking them about whether they were using complementary and alternative medicine, not related necessarily to the reason why they came in for surgery, but just in general. And that indicates again that 68% had used CAM. So this one was carried out, I think, forgot to mention the time there, 2008. So it must have been 2007 that this was carried out. And you can see the list there of those that was the most frequently mentioned. The herbal products most frequently mentioned: cod liver oil, primrose oil, garlic, cranberry. And then finally, a newspaper article just from this year, NHS Grampian defending its use of homeopathy, with prescription spend expected to rise, indicated that £90,000 a year was spent on homeopathic treatments, which of course is a small amount compared to what is spent on others, but considered to be controversial, I guess. That's as far as medicine is concerned. Over to foods. When we look at foods, then people, you might still go out foraging for brambles or from wild chanterelles, etc. And it's interesting to see that even the Visit Scotland website publishes a guide to wild food foraging, showing you what the legal context is, what you're allowed and not allowed, but also giving lots of suggestions on events and things to explore, etc. But another interesting aspect amongst foods is these types of products. Heather ale, wines produced from bramble, oak leaves, elderberry flowers, Isle of Harris gin infused with sugar kelp. And it sort of shows that in these types of products that contain small amounts of these plants, and they might not necessarily have been harvested locally. That's could be the case, but it could also be that it comes from elsewhere. Obviously, the plants are used to brand these items as being something natural, something local, something Scottish, something that maybe tourists are attracted to buying. So we move into the area then almost of becoming a symbolic use of those plants. So they become symbolic for Scottishness, symbolic for naturalness. And the same we see here in selling nature in soaps. Interesting to see that it's these symbolic plants that a lot of people associate with Scottish countryside as being used here: seaweed, heather. So that moves us into cultural uses or symbolism of plants. Yeah, and we can see that plants are everywhere. The thistle, of course, is the most common one. It's something I often ask students in the classes when they run, which plants they consider to be symbolic for Scotland, and the same types of plants get mentioned tend to be plants that are fairly common in the landscape, are particularly outstanding at particular times of the year. And of course, the thistle is always there as well. But when we look further at cultural uses, then we also see that plants play an important role in people's lives. They come in celebrations. For example, we often give plants or flowers as a gift, but some of those also have those extra meanings that we have: red roses, white heather, etc. Yeah. Christmas, soon there, also brings with it a lot of symbolism, both in the evergreens that we use to decorate the houses, but also in the foods that we associate with Christmas that are plant-based. And that symbolism and those cultural aspects also come across in other aspects of how we relate to plants. Gardening, for example. when you look at the reasons why people practice gardening and the kind of plants that people have in their gardens, then often plants have got strong associations for people with memories. And various of the students that I've taught over the years have done studies as part of the module with people on their garden to look at what plants are in the garden and why they're there. And you often see that there is plants there that were donated by someone, people move, they take certain plants with them, they have associations with people that have passed away or with friends, etc. And then a last aspect, looking at the environment. Again, some interesting examples here that I've found recently. So there's a newspaper article there indicating that seeds for dueling the A9 together with accountants could cost 9 million. It actually specifies that 1.2 million pounds could be spent on native flowering grass seeds. Again, it's a mixed message because the grass would probably be the big cost, but the native flowers seeds seemingly have a cost. That's an interesting story to pick up on, because of course the aspect of sowing native flowers would have been alien if you go back 50 years. But nowadays, native flower seeds are being produced just like crops, because in restoration work or in nature conservation work, and equally in agriculture, it is encouraged. Native flower seeds are often used to do restoration of the environment. So in a big infrastructure implementation, such as the dueling of the A9, where a lot of the natural area alongside the roads would get destroyed and needs to be restored afterwards, that would be done with native flower seeds. And so this is an interesting example where plant uses that we may not have considered possible going back in time are now quite important and can become quite important economic uses as well. So the production of native flower seeds, big business for some flower companies. And a second example from Sam's research on biofuel production from seaweeds. Seaweeds are interesting, they're not plants, of course, but also a local natural resource. Seaweeds are interesting because when you look at in historical times, they have often had a strong economic value. Locally harvested seaweeds, they have been used in lots of different ways in industries for the production of soda, for the production of glass and soap and fertilizer. They're still used nowadays for the production of alginates. And so now this research to look at whether the seaweeds can be used for the production of biofuel, but also with the concept of cultivating rather than harvesting wild. And so as a conclusion, after taking you through all those different examples of plant uses, especially the contemporary ones, and you can see that uses change all the time. So there's certain uses that we find now that we can see are based on some of those traditional or historical uses. And there's other uses that are completely new and that address certain needs that we have now, and that then force us to look again at solutions that we find in that natural world. So think about those environmental uses, the restoration of nature, the production of biofuels, also the production of drugs. Takes us always back to those natural resources that we have to see whether there's other ways in which we can use them. Obviously, we live in a reality where there's a lot of global exchanges and influence taking place. So we might explore the whole world for certain solutions to implement. And reality being that obviously nowadays we look rather at cultivation of those wild plants when we are going to be using them rather than harvesting from the wild. Thank you. That's it. Let me know if you have any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Veerle. That was fantastic. So interesting. And you just, took us through time there, starting off, far back in time, and then looking at how we're using these plants today for a variety of purposes. So you certainly have a lot of knowledge there, and I'm sure we have many questions there, and one has come up already. So just to tell everybody, if you want to ask a question, you can please put it under the Q&A tab that you will see on the right hand of your screen, and I will read the questions out. I have a few questions, and I'll have one question that's come through already. So I think we'll start with that one. So this one, it's an interesting point here, and it's good to hear what you have to say about this. Do you have any thoughts on how traditional medicines might have been discovered or refined in the first place? So I'm assuming.
What would have? Sorry, I missed the word. What would have been discovered or found?
Traditional medicines. How they might have been discovered or refined in the first place.
Well, it's a combination of needs. You have to find a solution to address certain problems, and trial and error would be the reality as well, of course. But when you look at traditional medicines, then something that is also typical about that is that there's a lot of differences across societies or across countries. So you don't necessarily find that one particular plant which is used to treat a particular problem in one country would have exactly the same use in another country or in another society. It might be used in complete different ways. Part of the reason is that plants have got a lot of compounds, and so there's a lot of plants that will have certain benefits because they have certain anti-inflammatory properties or antibacterial properties that might be mild. They might contain tannins or something like that. So they can probably apply it for a lot of different purposes. The reason they would be often conceived to be or perceived to be beneficial is that an important aspect, and that's a reality as well of traditional medicine, is that there's a lot to be said about the belief as well, and the ceremony that comes with it. When you look at traditional medicines, then the administering of a particular plant product is only one part of the healing process often. So there's often ceremonies involved, etc. We have got, and we know about that, we have got a placebo effect. So that has a strong effect as well. So people believe that what they are taking is going to be beneficial to them, is having an influence as well. Yeah. So you have this combination of things, trial and error. You need to find something. You're going to find a plant. And it evolves from that. The knowledge evolves from that, but often evolves in different ways in different cultural contexts.
Thank you. That was a big question for you. But we have some other questions that come up here. So the first one is, thank you, Veerle, for such an interesting presentation. You mentioned native plants. I wondered who decides what constitutes native, as presumably this has changed over time.
Yeah. The same with wild plants. I mean, we talk about wild plants, but a lot of them aren't really wild anymore either. If you look at plants such as brambles, for example, yes, they're wild, but they're also somehow managed, they're allowed to stay in certain areas and not in other areas. So the connotation of wild plants, native plants, plants move around all the time, and that is a reality. Yeah. So I don't think I want to define exactly what is a native plant, because indeed there is always that natural evolution that plants get exchanged, become naturalized. We have got some indication of certain plants that we consider to be non-native and we don't really want there, or they become sort of too oppressive. But yeah, what exactly is a native plant? It's sort of making that distinction between certain things that are crops. From certain plants, we know exactly how they've come to be in a particular place. Certain plants we know are typically in gardens. They might escape from the gardens, but yeah, then you have what grows in the countryside. But of course, there is things there that have moved in. That's reality.
Yeah, thanks. We have another question sort of leading on from that, saying, are there major challenges with non-native or invasive plants in Scotland that stand out? If so, what are they and how are they being dealt with?
I don't think I'm an expert on that, on dealing with invasive plants in Scotland. So I think that's a question better asked somebody else. I would imagine that there's rhododendrons in certain areas would be considered obnoxious, invasive, and also the giant hogweed, for example. But yeah, how do you deal with that? Need to find a plant remedy, I guess.
Yeah, we need to call on you. These problems. Okay, so there's another question here. I don't think you mentioned mistletoe, which I believe is being used or considered for skin cancer. And that in Gaelic, it sort of literally means panacea, like an all cure. Do you have any knowledge on that?
No. But of course, there's a lot of plants that have been used for that have been in the past and are being used now for herbal treatments. Yeah. So this was just a quick walkthrough. I don't have personal knowledge on what the properties would be of mistletoe for medicinal purposes. No.
Yeah, I guess there are, more or less, endless potential there, and they can be tried out over time as well. Okay, so the next one, sorry, I just remember my email switched off. I'll get rid of that annoying noise. So yeah, next question. With the doctrine of signatures having held sway for quite a long time, do you think that the placebo effect based on strong religious belief in their efficacy was why this lasted so long? The reason I ask is modern science has suggested that many don't have scientific support for how they were used.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, that is. If you only already look at that example, the euphrasia for eye bright, so it is nowadays still used as a herbal remedy for the treatment of eye infections. There's not much scientific evidence to support that. There is some literature of small studies have been found to indicate that it could be beneficial, and it has some antibacterial or anti-inflammatory properties. But so would probably be many other plant extracts. I mean, tea bags can be used to treat eye infections. Yeah, so again, that would have certain properties that sort of clean out the eyes and wouldn't do any damage. That's the other main thing. So the reality is that there is certain herbal remedies for which you can find scientific evidence that they have particular properties, and those would be examples of where maybe drugs would have been developed from them in a more controlled way. There's a lot of other herbal remedies where that scientific evidence isn't there. Does it mean they are useless? No. If people get benefit from it and feel that it treats them, then that is an important given. And that can indeed be partly through a placebo effect are partly true. Some people benefiting from it and others not. That is reality in healing as well, that not everyone reacts in the same way.
Yeah, that last point is very interesting, actually, thinking about that. There's obviously a lot of discussion about homeopathy, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a typical one where continues to be very controversial, because there is no scientific evidence that it has any benefits, but there is a lot of people that use it, and is all of that due to the placebo effect, all of that benefit, or is it something else? It's an important aspect if you look at CAM therapies nowadays and the role they play in society. A well-known fact is also that CAM therapists take a lot more time with their patients than a GP would be able to do, and that is an important aspect in healing as well. So there's also that relationship, the therapist listening to you, taking time to listen to your problems. There is evidence that it's well known that is an important aspect. If GPs had as much time as a therapist could spend an hour with you discussing a problem, then that might have a different effect as well. So there's all these aspects that you need to take into account, and it's not only about the scientific evidence always.
Yeah, isn't that interesting to
Yeah.
think that it might be a different situation if GPs had more time.
But the important thing to consider there is also the fact that the World Health Organization actively encourages, recognizes traditional therapies as having a role to play in the provision of health services in any country. So as a society, they indicate we shouldn't just rely on drugs. We should take into account those other therapies that are there, because they have a role to play.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, so next question. Do you think that the current situation of using native plants in these various ways is on the whole being done sustainably? That's interesting.
I think on a whole, yes, because I don't see evidence that there is high frequency use of native plants by a big percentage of the population. Yeah, whilst all of us might know that you can pick brambles for jam, or you can go and harvest certain leaves for salads, the amount of people actually doing that is very little. You know, I can't remember when I last went to pick brambles. It's probably when my kids were small, because then it's fun. But so there is some level of picking that becomes commercial, but again, that would be fairly well controlled. So mushrooms are a typical one there, where there's a code of conduct for picking mushrooms, and the companies that would be trading in mushrooms would need to abide by that as well, to make sure that there's no over harvesting. I don't think there's evidence in Scotland that any wild harvest that takes place would be non-sustainable. I guess where there might be a risk is where certain plants are imported from abroad, because then maybe you don't control that. So if you look, for example, at things such as elderberry products, elderflower products, that wouldn't be somebody going out and picking that wild in Scotland, because that would be just too costly. A lot of the time that might be imported from Eastern Europe, where wages are lower. And then, of course, we don't know whether that harvest is sustainable or isn't. That's probably the control we don't have.
Yeah. Thank you. So the next question says, does Scotland have a similar plant culture to other countries? Is it more similar to England or Scandinavia?
That's a bit of both, probably, all those cultural influences. And again, there might be that might be easier answered by somebody with more Scottish roots than myself to understand where the influences come from historically. When you look at contemporary things, then I think it's more widely. Then it's sort of this global influence that you have, especially if you look at medicines that are used nowadays and that you find being sold. That comes from everywhere. Yeah, that's probably all I can say about that.
Yeah, no, that's hard. And Scandinavia also is very varied, you know, it's a large area, so there's lots of variation there too, of course. So that's hard. And the next one is more of a comment. As an Orkney botanist, I would suggest that the most invasive plant here is salmonberry, smothering our native willow carp, plus garden escapees hybriding with native island endemics. I don't know if you have a comment on that. Or, yeah, so that's just... okay, let me go to the chat where there are some other questions. Okay, I wonder what influence genetic manipulation has on our contemporary use of plants. In the past, perhaps plants had set properties, so their use was defined by that. Now, because that can be manipulated and changed, I wonder if designer plants are playing a bigger part for good uses, thinking of the projects to create food sources that are cheaply and readily available for populations vulnerable to famine.
Yeah, but genetic manipulation, that would mainly be applied to crops in those very controlled ways. I don't know of examples where that would be applied in more native ways. It might be used in the production of certain drugs, and again to produce the particular characteristics that are needed. I don't see it as posing a threat to native plants overall. It sits in the area of agriculture and crop production.
Yeah, thank you. And then just to let everybody know, if they haven't seen it, that somebody has posted a link to a short little video, Naomi Lamb, Why We're Dependent on Plants for Medicine. So people can have a look at that as well. I don't know if that's something that you're familiar with, Veerle.
I can't actually see the chat box in the view.
Yeah, it's a bit tricky. You need to go between the chat and the Q&A. But I can send that to you later if you're interested. If you can't see it now, and I can get it to you.
I only see the only view I have is some people. I don't see where I would see the.
Yeah, the chat is
okay,
in
I
the
see
right-hand
it's on
corner.
my other. Sorry, yeah. It's in my other screen. Yeah, it's still where my. Okay, yeah. Now I see it.
So you can have a look at that later on. Yeah. So I can't see other questions on the chat, but feel free to post them. I mean, I had a question as well. I thought it was interesting. You talked about the symbolic use of plants, you know, in sort of Scottish products, etc. And I was wondering whether you were even implying that they might be adding these herbs or whatever more for effect rather than they're actually adding to the taste. I mean, do people know what these things taste like and they would look for that, or is it more a marketing thing?
I think, well, it's a combination of things. If you look, for example, at heather ale, then I think heather was used in the past also for in brewing to give that flavor. I know there's an example, bog myrtle, for example, might be used also in brewing. I think it's a combination of it. It will have a certain flavor, but there's definitely also that strong, cultural aspect or symbolic aspect or the branding aspect. Sugar kelp in gin. I mean, a lot of plants are used for the production of gins. Yeah, juniper berry is the the particular one, would we taste the seaweed in the gin? I'm not sure, but it has a certain appeal for people. I mean, I would be the same as well. I might want to try to just see what it what it tastes. Heather soap. Does heather have particular properties that warrants it being put into soap? It could be that if it's the heather flowers, that it gives you that scrubbing action. So it's a bit like putting oat bran in soaps as well. It could be that it's that. Can you smell heather in soap? I doubt it, actually. So, but it's a combination of things, but still it appeals to people. Eh? It's that natural aspect. There was a time when the Body Shop was very popular with those types of things, isn't it? And the link to nature, it's since been largely abandoned, but there was a time that they pitched very strongly on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of the questions, and we've heard a lot from you. So many interesting points, and I think we've all learnt a lot about plants and medicine and traditional foods in Scotland. So thank you so much, Veerle, for coming along today.
You're welcome.
It was enjoyable, and we have lots of thanks coming up here as well. So everybody is very pleased. And also to remind everybody that it has been recorded, and in the next few days we'll make the recording available on our website and via Facebook and Twitter as well. So keep an eye out for that. And then after Christmas we'll have a whole new series starting up again with other talks as well. So we'll keep posting about that as well. So thank you very much, and thanks everybody for coming, and thank you, Veerle.
Thank you. Bye-bye.